Good evening. My name is Katie Zontak, and I'm the Cultural Arts Director at the JCC in Buffalo, New York. I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's final Tuesday Talkback event on the film An Irrepressible Woman, Je ne rêve que de voir, included in the 36th Annual Buffalo International Jewish Film Festival, which wraps up its 3-week virtual festival this Friday. We are grateful to have had the opportunity to present 13 amazing films and special events to the Buffalo community and beyond, and thank you for your support. I would like to thank our sponsor for the film and tonight's talkback, Hadassah. The format for tonight's program will be a discussion on the film led by Dr. Eileen M Angelini and Marcus Steiner. Before I welcome and introduce our speakers, I'd like to just mention that we encourage the viewers to send appropriate questions and comments through the YouTube chat during the program, and we'll do our best to get through to them at the end of the program during the Q&A. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. And I'm going to begin with Dr. Eileen M Angelini, and I'm going to ask that she jump in for the correct pronunciation of an honor that was bestowed on her. So Eileen, if you do us the kind gesture of helping me out here, and then I'll continue from there.
Okay, Chevalier dans l'ordre des Palmes académiques.
Thank you. Was awarded to her in August 2011, and it's an award created by Napoleon Bonaparte in March 1808 as a reward for devotion and accomplishment in the realm of teaching. She received her BA in French from Middlebury College, Middlebury, Vermont, and her MA and PhD in French Studies from Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. A 2010-2011 Fulbright Scholar and a 2013 through 2017 Fulbright Specialist, Dr. Angelini is presently Associate Dean of the School for Graduate Studies at SUNY Empire State College. One of her primary areas of research is the World War II occupation of France. She is particularly honored to be the inaugural Holocaust Education Fellow at the Crane Center for Mass Atrocity Prevention. And joining her in conversation tonight is Marcus Steiner, the co-founder and chief executive officer of the Crane Center for Mass Atrocity Prevention. Much of his work focuses on the use of digital technology in mass atrocities in East and Southeast Asia, the Holocaust, and mass atrocity prevention. And he has presented his work at keynotes and conferences across the country, including Binghamton University's Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention and Columbia University. Marcus has previously served with a number of nonprofits and has led programming, operations, fundraising, and research divisions before founding the Crane Center. In addition to his work with the Crane Center, Marcus also serves on the board of directors for the Sentinel Project, a Toronto-based mass atrocity prevention organization, and as the operations lead for the Sustainable Progress and Equality Collective, a nonprofit dedicated to uniting the fields of DEI and STAM. So I want to welcome you both tonight, and thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katie. And thank you, everyone, for having us tonight. We are very excited to be here, very excited to have this opportunity to connect with you all. I know many of those out there are already familiar with Dr. Angelini and some of her work, especially those in the Buffalo area. So I want to start off tonight by offering a little bit of background as to the Crane Center and how our work kind of ties into this whole education piece with film and the like. So the Crane Center for Mass Atrocity Prevention is an organization that I co-founded with my colleague Amber Mays when we recognized that the current approaches we had to Holocaust education and mass atrocity prevention had largely brought us to a standstill in the field. We found there was a large disconnect between scholars and practitioners, between survivors and those who would want to record their stories, and those who would record the stories and those who could take those lessons and move them forward into the modern day. And so we sought to find ways that we could build bridges between all of these groups. And one thing that we found is that in these disconnects, when we were able to start bringing people together to share ideas, to share methodologies, that we were really able to make significant progress. And In just the year that we've existed, not even a year yet, we have had the pleasure of serving and helping work with over 15,000 people internationally, including being able to take the lessons of the Holocaust that we will ideally be able to touch on tonight and bring those to the modern day, which helped us work in refugee camps in Chad, which has helped us work in the camps in Bangladesh where the Rohingya live, and have helped us connect with our lawmakers to help address the ongoing genocide of the Uyghur in Xinjiang in China. And so through this work, I've been fortunate enough to connect with Dr. Angelini through a screening of her film, actually, France Divided, and found in her an individual who shares the same passions that the Crane Center was founded upon, and shares the desire to break the mold that we have created over the last 75, 76 years of Holocaust education, and really challenge the norms that we have and that face us every day in this field. And so with that in mind, I would like to turn the mic over to Dr. Angelini, who is going to initially give us some of the historical context to this film, An Irrepressible Woman, and some more information on France at the time this film takes place. As Katie mentioned, Dr. Angelini is a Fulbright scholar. She is also a Fulbright specialist. She had been invited to take place in the Olga Langell Institute, Tolly, for those familiar. She was also invited to the U.S. Holocaust War Museum's Holocaust Institute for Teacher Educators. And along with her work at the Crane Center as our inaugural Holocaust Education Fellow, has offered numerous talkbacks on Holocaust films. And I have been fortunate to work with her, not just within the Crane Center, but in my work as the program director of the Kansas Holocaust Museum in the past, and as the operations director for the nonprofit Together We Remember, where we were partnered up on a talkback for the film Resistance, another film set in Holocaust era France. So I would like now to turn over the mic to Dr. Angelini. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Okay, so I do like when there's lots of questions that come in, so that way, please do submit your questions, because I possibly cannot anticipate everything that you're thinking of, and I want to make sure that your questions are as addressed as fully as possible. But let me begin by saying that France is the only country in the world, and this is very important for understanding the context of France from 1939 to at least 1950, and then things started to unravel. But France is the only country in the world that can say the following four things. It first was defeated by Germany, then occupied by Germany, then collaborated with Germany, and finally declared victory over Germany. So once again, I'm going to say that with my finger. So defeated, and I'm doing it the French way because they start with a thumb, not with the pointer. So defeated by the Germans, occupied by the Germans, collaborated with the Germans, and declared victory over the Germans. What does that mean about France? It was a very divided country. Hence the title of the documentary film that I did with Barbara Barnett, France Divided, because we worked with survivors to understand what was happening in France, that there was such division. Why was there such this political separation? Bear in mind that France is able to say it declared victory over the Germans because of being one of the four Allied forces. There are other countries that have said, oh, well, we also fought for the Allies, but the four official Allies are the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and France. So there are also other countries that can say three of the four things or two of the four things that France is able to say. So before the German invasion, it's important to understand that the left side of the government was gaining control. In other words, Léon Blum and his party members were gaining control. And before the invasion, the Communist Party was in control of the government, meaning their version of the Congress. one of the things that they did was they took prayer out of the public schools, because France by history is a Catholic country. But because they were trying to make everything equal, they took prayer out of the public schools. This made the right side of the government very nervous. The other thing that you see in the film that Léon Blum is very famous for was he made a 40-hour work week and paid vacation. And we all know about how the French love their paid vacation and they disappear in the month of August. If you go to France, everything closes down in August. You still have grocery stores and restaurants, but everything else is going to close down. That's traditionally their time of the year to take vacations. So Léon Blum, even though he was communist, had a really faithful following because he was really fighting for the common citizen. Notice I didn't say man, being inclusive here, the common citizen, men and women, everybody involved, for having a 40-hour work week and paid vacation. So when the Germans invaded and they were able to quickly defeat the French, so quickly that the Germans defeated the French faster than they overtook Poland. That's how quick it was. Léon Blum took a lot of hits for that because they're saying that he deflected some of the military towards the Republicans in Spain who were resisting against Franco, but that's another story in itself. Suffice it to say that the right side of the government was thrilled that the Germans came in, and they were ready to collaborate because in collaborating, they regained control of the government and they were able to oust the left side. Now, as opposed to the United States, where we have two main political parties, at any point in time, recently I checked, there were 22 political parties in France. So the French take pride in having lots of political parties and expressing their opinions. So the Germans come in, they collaborate with the right side of the government. The fascists were thrilled to able to oust the communists. And you have Maréchal Pétain, who was a World War I hero because he claimed victory at Verdun in World War I. He's 80 years old, a little bit of a megalomaniac, likes to be in the center of attention. He's like, yes, I will give my body, my heart and soul to France to protect it. Everybody trusted Pétain. He had that grandfatherly image. People didn't realize that he was actually a puppet of the Germans and doing their dirty work. So for the first couple of years of the occupation, everybody's following Pétain. The other thing that's more important is you have Pia Laval, who is his prime minister. Pia Laval was a party hopper. He actually started on the left side of the government, and he actually worked his way. He would hop parties to stay in power, and he ended up on the right. He was an avid anti-Semite who worked towards, he was quoted as saying he wanted to exterminate all Jews. In many ways, some of the things that he did were worse than Hitler. So the fascists are now in power. They want to stay in power, and they put prayer back into the public schools. So they're getting momentum behind them of popular things because prayer being taken out of the schools was not popular. The 40-hour work week and paid vacation was popular. So now, why was Léon Blum put on trial? A couple things to think about. He and a couple other politicians were known as the Vichy 80 because when Pétain was voted in by his congressmen, there were 80 of them that said no. And so they're referred to as the Vichy 80. The other 400 plus, okay, we've lost. They believe Pétain. We've got to do what's best for the French. We're going to collaborate with the Germans. I'm simplifying, but I want to make sure I cover as much ground as I possibly can. So Pétain's in power. You have the Vichy 80 that some of them were like, okay, had left France but came back to stand trial. You see that in the film because they believed the French government would do a fair trial and they were not going to be seen as cowards. But more importantly, Léon Blum, as well as George Mandel, who at the very end of the film, were seen as bargaining chips. Got to keep these high-profile politicians alive because the Germans started to realize they were losing the war. And if they wanted to get some of their people back, or if they wanted to do a reasonable capitulation or a reasonable treaty, they wanted bargaining chips. So Léon Blum was a top-notch bargaining chip. So that's why he was being kept alive. What you don't see in the film is that he actually was not in Buchenwald at the end of the war. He was actually from Buchenwald, sent to Dachau and a couple other places. And he actually was supposed to be executed, and so was Jeannot. But the local authorities said, no, we're not going to do this. And then they were returned to France. So you don't see those things in the film. But once again, this is a film that is based loosely on a novel written about Jeanne. So how about we take some questions and see if we can build upon my introduction. Marcus is checking to see if any questions have come. And there's no questions. Oh, come on, please. You're muted, Marcus.
I am muted. That is okay. I've actually prepared a couple just in case, so we can start priming folks. So we mentioned the trial of the Vichy 80 and Blum's value as a bargaining chip for not only the fascist French, but for the Germans towards the end of the war. However, prior to being sent to Buchenwald, as we mentioned, Blum is on trial by Vichy France. So what was the reasoning? Why was Vichy willing to halt Blum's trial instead of seeing that through to kind of vindicate themselves?
Because he gave in such an impassioned speech in his own defense that was very eloquent, right on target, that the Vichy French realized if they continue with the trial, it was going to do more damage for them than good. So once again, we're just gonna close up shop and hope we can put that under the carpet.
So even kind of in exile, even imprisoned, Blum represented a threat to the fascist Vichy government.
Yes, yes.
And kind of continue on this thread of Blum as this bargaining chip and the like. His position as a former prime minister obviously shielded him from the fate that many French Jews unfortunately suffered during the Holocaust. But Jeannot, the woman from whose perspective we actually see everything, she is both Jewish and wealthy. Two very dangerous things to be in France during the Second World War. Apart from her later marriage to Léon Blum, what historically or what precedent is there for her to have been shielded as long as she was?
Well, her first husband was a lawyer, a very well-known lawyer. You do see him in the film with her son, and she actually had two sons, Jean and Georges. And Jean, the older son, had some disabilities. So you don't see in the film that she keeps him with her until finally when she goes to Buchenwald, she sends her son Jean with I believe it was with a cousin, but I could be mistaken with that. So the first husband carried a lot of political clout as well. And he was, in her words, a philandering flirt. So that's why she divorced him. And then she married her second husband, who was the founder of the Prix Unique grocery stores, department stores, sort of like an all-purpose store. So she had a lot of political friends protecting her. And you see in the film how she had the meeting right with Pia Laval. Now, Pia Laval, knowing how he was an avid anti-Semite, for him to receive her and talk to her was huge. She obviously had good political connections that would have been detrimental to Laval if he didn't meet with her. So, and very, very wealthy, very, very wealthy. And you don't really see her suffering. I must say that as a mother myself, the fact that her priority was to be with Léon and not be with both her children, and her second husband did commit suicide. He said to her that if you go to him, if you leave me for him, I'm going to commit suicide. He made good on it because he brought Georges to the first husband, where he was not in New York, but in, I believe it was Argentina where they went,
Or Brazil.
or was it Brazil? I believe it was Argentina. And after the son was safe, he committed suicide. So to have that on her conscience as well, I couldn't have done that. I mean, but that's, you know, I'm here in the 21st century, and she was living during times of war. So it's not really fair to judge. And we don't see all of it in this film. So there's different ways that the stories have been told and retold, and the truth may get distorted. But as a viewer, to see that, where she was putting her love for Leon above everything else, was hard for me to see.
Right. And it like I said, it is always difficult to, you know, try to look back, especially World War II era Europe, to try to understand the decisions people made from our modern day perspective. It's something very, I would say, in the United States, especially, very few of us could really understand what mindset anyone would be in at that point, right?
Mm-hmm.
We do have a question coming in from Rick Collins, and it really would pick up effectively after the movie ends. So Rick is asking, can you tell us about Bloom and Jeannot after the war?
Yes. Oh, and I see Lindsay's. I know Lindsay. Sorry, I was a little distracted there, Rick. Sorry, I know Lindsay because I worked with her husband, Nicolas. After the war, they go back to Jouy-en-Jossaye, which is very, very near Versailles. I have very good friends from when I was an undergrad in Paris that lived in Jouy-en-Jossaye, so I know that area very well. He lives and goes for about till 1951, I believe, or 1950. He dies at the age of 71. And he gets back into politics a little bit. De Gaulle uses him literally, you know, for political cover of reunifying France. But de Gaulle and Léon Blum were not friends. Let's just say they were adversaries. Might want to say frenemies, because they were working towards a common goal. She lives another 32 years. She claims, and I read an article just on Sunday that was an interview with her granddaughter, and also with the author of the book that the film is based upon. And Lindsay also says, hello, sorry. She commits suicide. She takes an overdose of pills, but she planned it. She had said that after Léon died that she would commit suicide. It took her 32 years. Perhaps she was, you know, it wasn't as quickly as she said she would do it. So you have to wonder what happened there. But in the interview, and if you Google Jeannot, the interview will come up. The granddaughter explains that her grandmother was very precise about how she was going to do it, and she was making sure that the granddaughter had everything from her life. And once it got to the end, they knew it was getting close, and she says, okay, tonight I'm going to do it. And sure enough, she did it. She was a woman of her word. So she did commit suicide by taking an overdose of pills.
So that kind of ties in how the beginning of the film, it kind of reads off as a letter to the granddaughter then.
Correct.
So
correct.
And that's okay. Okay, fantastic.
And she did build that school that's named after her, and that she gave her name to, but something that Léon would have been very proud of. She was true to that.
Fantastic. Okay, so we do have a question from Lindsay. Says, do you know what portion of the French population agreed with collaborating with the Nazis? And what was the reason they didn't put up a fight?
Okay. If you go by the official statistics, 17% of the population collaborated, 2% resisted. So what does that mean about the other 81%? They were trying to survive the war. However, with people that I've interviewed and survivors, as well as witnesses, as well as righteous Gentiles, there were people that didn't think they were resisting, but they were resisting because it was against the law to help a Jew in any fashion, form, or way. So people that hid Jews or gave food to a Jew or helped them get from point A to point B were resisting because that was against the law. So the other thing to bear in mind too is that there were people that were collaborating by actively being part of the black market, but they're not going to be part of the official 17%, because that 17% is going to be coming from government officials that aligned with the Germans. So those numbers are a little murky, so it's hard to say. I've also been asked, have you ever interviewed a collaborator? And I said, do you think I could get a collaborator on film to admit to the wrongdoing that was committed during World War II? I haven't been able to get a collaborator to give me an interview, but there are novels and autobiographies and memoirs being written by second generation and third generation survivors of collaborators, and writing about the shame it was to grow up knowing that your parents or your grandparents had been collaborators during World War II. So now that those are coming out, we're getting more information and better insight into how much of France collaborated versus how much resisted.
And it's also important to note that not everyone existed in the kind of the black and white resistor, liberator, collaborator kind of zone. An example I always like to use is Oskar Schindler. At the beginning of the war, Schindler was more than happy to use the cheap to free labor of Jews to enrich himself. And it wasn't until he found his line in the sand that he went from a member of the Nazi Party, actively utilizing the oppression of the Jews, to transition to liberator. It's just, people had different kind of lines in the sand, as it were. So there are a lot of people who existed in that gray area, and that 80-something% of people in France, we shouldn't take it that they were standing by doing nothing. They were trying to survive, and as you said, Eileen, there are so many different forms of rescue and resistance. Most stories that we'll never hear, but I do kind of. Oh, go ahead.
And I was also going to say, and there's also people that believed wholeheartedly Pétain, what he was saying, that this is right for France, we have to collaborate. And then you get to about 1942, what I call the straw that broke the camel's back, was the Valdiv roundup. And that's when people started to say, okay, this is starting to not really be cool. And that shifted a lot of public opinion.
Yeah, as the Holocaust became more common knowledge, you do see that shift across Europe of where that gray area becomes a lot less populated, where your collaborators become firmer collaborators, or where your liberators become firmer, resistors become firmer, where you see fewer bystanders existing, as news leaks of what's happening, not just in the concentration labor camps of Dachau, Buchenwald, and the camps in France, but in the death camps in Eastern Europe as well. But to kind of hit on what you mentioned about interviewing collaborators, there is a book by Eric A. Johnson. It's called What We Knew: Terror, Mass Murder, and Everyday Life in Nazi Germany. It's about 15 years old now, but it contains oral histories of liberators, of bystanders, and of collaborators in Nazi Germany, not necessarily in France, but Nazi Germany. So for those who are interested in kind of hearing those accounts from the Holocaust, that is an option. Again, it's Eric Johnson, What We Knew. You can get on Amazon. It's a good text to understand. Take it with a grain of salt that, when you do get a collaborator or perpetrator to sit down, you are very likely getting a watered down version of events, if accurate at all. But moving on to our next question from Ellen Goldstein, says, do you think it was realistic that they lived next to Buchenwald and had no idea what was there? Merci.
Thank you so much for that question. And no, that's not realistic, because before Jeanne arrived, avant son arrivée, sorry, I did a code switch there. Before she arrived to be with him, both Léon and George Mandel were in the camp itself. They were in, the bunks. They might have been in preferred bunks, and there was, that's still to be determined. But they were separated from the other Jewish victims. But they were behind closed doors of Buchenwald. When it was realized that they were going to need Léon and George for political clout, that's when they were moved into the hunting lodge. You see a little bit of foreshadowing where Leon is talking about the smell and like how it comes every day, and he's not really talking about it. Is that artistic license for his way of showing that he was trying to protect her from the realities of knowing what was happening in Buchenwald? Perhaps. The other thing is you see a little bit of an allusion to it when she says, "Oh, we don't hear any birds singing." So that for me, that says, okay, she has an idea that there's more to be known than what is being easily visible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you collect accounts, and I'm sure you ran into this with France Divided as well. That if anyone ever travels to Birkenau, there are places you can stand in the camp that are behind the wire where you can see houses. Now, granted, later in the war, a lot of those homes were taken for German officers, German soldiers, but there's camps that are right across the lakes from villages where people claimed ignorance. I think it's hard to say that the hunting lodge that was built on the grounds of Buchenwald, even if they had never stepped foot in the camp, at least they had some way to communicate with the German guards, and the guards talked. At the very least, they would have had some idea of what was happening there. But it's hard to admit. And again, we're going off a film that's based off a novel. But it's hard for folks to admit, especially survivors that were fortunate enough to avoid the worst of the camps, that they knew what was happening, because again, people want to look at it from our modern day perspective and ask, well, why didn't you do anything? Well, you're a little overpowered there. Go ahead.
I was just going to talk about the difference in the American or the English language title for the film and the original French title. So the original, and I know there's another question coming in, but let me do this and then we'll take the next question. The original French title is Je ne rêve que de vous, which means I dream only of you. And that's Jean's perspective during the film. She's only thinking about Léon. She's obsessed with him. And it's also the song that was being sung by all the women while they were waiting, while their husbands and their loved ones were put on trial. And if you look at the subtitles for those lyrics, it's very, very telling. The American title, or the English language title, An Irrepressible Woman, that you hear a couple times, and once again, this is a language issue. You see irrepressible used in the subtitles. It's not necessarily what they're saying in French, but they're saying she's stubborn. She's, she's, the vision that comes to mind is, but it's not the words that were being used, but the vision that comes to mind when I heard it in French was like she was perceived as being a dog with a bone that was not going to let go. Okay. So yes, she was an irrepressible woman, but for me, an irrepressible woman is someone that that would be doing it for the common good. Whereas I see Jeannon as Je ne rêve que de vous, is doing it because she wants to be with the man she loves. It's not for the common good. So that's where I feel a little shift in the title. But once again, would American audiences or English language audiences prefer to go to a film that has a title of An Irrepressible Woman versus I Dream Only of You? So when they create titles for films, foreign language films, and they create English language titles, sometimes there's marketing that goes into the explanation for why they change the title that they do.
Yeah. I mean, the direct French translation almost sounds like a Nicholas Sparks book. Like I don't think anyone would go to that expecting to see an historical Holocaust film. But actually, kind of building off that, the French title really drives home her perspective on things. As a filmmaker yourself, what do you kind of make of the decision to focus on these historical events of Leon Blum, the Vichy 80, and the like, but from the perspective of Jeannon instead of Leon Blum?
I think because recently there's been especially in France, there's been the opening of archives that are showing more of the roles played by women during the occupation of France, as well as the liberation of France. If you know about Madeleine Foco, who was the leader of the French resistance within France, and she did get to London a couple times, and that was different from the OSC that was created by Churchill. So she was not recognized in her time, and that mainly was because you had Charles de Gaulle in power, and a woman wouldn't be capable of doing that. And Charles de Gaulle wanted to come in and unify France, and they had been run over, and you have to rebuild French pride. But I think now, especially within the last 5 years, where so much more is coming out about women and the roles they played in resistance, I think that was a key move with this film, to tell it from her perspective, and do it from a different lens, rather than just doing it from an historical, okay, Leon Blum did X, Y, and Z. And attract a different type of audience that might not have gone to see a straight documentary film.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think it makes us broaden our perspective on what it means to resist, right? Like, and I'm finding our theme here is resistance. Is she had her Leon's daughter-in-law smuggle letters to him. She followed him. She gave the Germans all hell to try to be able to get this visitation pass. She used every ounce of clout that her family had to pull favors to be with him. It's, I don't want to use the cliche of the power behind the throne here, but she was a large part of what kept Bloom going, right? The opportunities to visit. For anyone who struggles with mental health issues would recognize Bloom when she first goes to see him, when she gets the visitation pass for the first time, where her first thing is, you stink. He hasn't bathed, he hasn't shaved, he hasn't cut his hair, he stopped taking care of himself. That's pretty classic. The man's depressed, and that's you can't fight for a country when you're depressed,
Right.
especially at the scale Bloom was doing. But yeah, I think you're right. I think it's important that we acknowledge Jeannot, because she was important to Bloom's story. Yes, she was the third wife who came at the end of his life, but the end of his life was pretty busy.
Yes.
with historical events. And yes, we do miss out on some of this historical context. I, not being the expert on France myself, there are some things I had to go back and look up, specifically about the trial of Bloom. But at the same time, I feel like having them just hint at some things, hint at her son's fighting, hint at mentioning resistance forces, mentioning the trials, but not getting that full access that the movie could have given us, but kept it from her perspective. She's not allowed in the courtroom, so we're not going to see the courtroom. Really inspired me to go back and look, do the actual historical readings, which at the end of the day, isn't that kind of what we rely on historical fiction for?
Right. Historical fiction, the historians will set the fact patterns, and historical fiction gives us the sense of knowing what it felt to live like during those times. So
that's perfectly stated. I'm going to steal that, actually.
Just give me credit for it. Make a little footnote.
Yes. So still waiting on other questions to come in. I definitely encourage folks to. We have another 19-20 minutes that we can fill. But I was kind of curious if you had done any reading on the son that it actually mentions in the film, Georges, who actually managed to flee France, but we find out at the end ultimately died in combat with the Germans.
Right, and that's pretty accurate. He did get back up to London. He did meet the mother who he married, and but he did die in combat. So that is accurate in the film. I'm also thinking about one other thing that I want to say before I forget, is that Georges Mandel, who at the end was he didn't die exactly the way they said he died. So while he was being transported from Buchenwald back to France, he was captured by the Vichy milice, which is like your elite police force, your paramilitary police force, and he was killed by them.
That's a whole different.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I know they kind of vaguely mentioned he was assassinated. Didn't necessarily point out it was by Vichy. So I suppose then it just with your knowledge base here, why would they take Mandel and leave Bloom? Obviously Bloom was the larger bargaining chip here, former,
Right.
at that point, 2-time prime minister. But Bloom was important enough to stick him in the hunting lodge as well. Is it maybe, they had planned to move Bloom, but the assassination of Mandel made it too dangerous? Or
well, I think you have to think about how they were put on trial. So Bloom was put on trial for not preparing the French to defend themselves, and Mandel was put on trial for creating the war. So if you look at the two, who do you want to get rid of first? Because Bloom, well, he didn't prepare France well enough for war because he was sending arms elsewhere, which no, he didn't, because that was one of his biggest regrets, was not helping the Republicans in Spain. But if you look at the two, who do you want to sacrifice first? It's going to be Georges Mandel.
right, the one that you're directly blaming for.
Yeah,
Right.
because he's the one that created the war with Germany, that put us in this mess to begin with.
Yeah.
Which is far from the truth.
An interesting note for when Bloom was actually prime minister, if you go back and look at historical record, there was actually an increase in French armaments. He actually better equipped their military, they had military advances, officially got rid of the stationary blocks that led them to lose the First World War so quickly.
Right.
But yeah, obviously the fascists aren't going to give credit where it's due on that front.
Propaganda does does a lot of ills in this world.
Well, and actually that brings me to, and if we don't have any other questions pop up, what will probably be our last question of tonight. There's multiple scenes where Jeannot and Mandel and Bloom are in the hunting lodge. Okay, we actually will have another one. Yeah, let's hit this one before we go where I was going. Another one from Lindsay. She says, in the film, I got the impression that they had been having an affair much before he was in prison, but then I read that their relationship really blossomed when he was taken away. Can you speak to that?
If you do read the interview that was done with her granddaughter, as well as the author of the book upon which the film was based, he went into I don't want to say depression. I would say a funk after his wife died. And Jeannot, who had met him when she was very young, because remember, Léon Blum was not intending to be a politician. He wanted to be a literary critic. And he was deeply impacted by the Dreyfus affair in the 19th century and supporting Zola, who was defending Dreyfus. So that, and then Jean Jaurès, who was a prime minister and a politician, was a big inspiration for him, and that kind of shifted things. So before he went officially into politics, when he was in one of the literary salons of Paris, it was hosted at her parents' house, and she immediately fell in love with him. It was love at first sight. But meanwhile, he's not looking at her because he's married, but she remembers him talking to Marcel Proust, talking about Goethe. So she had this infatuation with Bloom from a very, very young age. And after his second wife died, she kind of went in there to help pick up the pieces. And it was an infatuation that she had. And I think slowly he came to reciprocate on the love. And then it built from there. And that's why Laval also said it was ironic that he was in Buchenwald in the hunting lodge, because that was where Goethe had originally written some of his work. So Leon Blum should be happy to be there.
Always be happy to be in prison, right?
Yes.
So kind of the final question that I had, like I said, we had talked about propaganda and mentioned that the multiple scenes where they're huddled around the radio in the hunting lodge, and I believe it was a newspaper actually came in that showed that who they called the French Goebbels had been killed, and when they knew that things were about to get turned on their head. Can you give us a little more context to that scene? Because it was obviously very pivotal to the film. Is when we, find out we're gonna lose somebody here, but we really don't have much historical context to that.
Well, also too, what's interesting is, did they really have access to a radio, and did they really have access to those newspapers? That I don't know. But we're getting to the point where the war is the tide of the war is changing. The Allied forces are having an impact. And I think that's kind of the director's way of showing that, okay, we've got to kind of show how the characters are finding out about what's happening beyond the prison walls. I would think it also was more, they were hearing it by word of mouth by some of the officers, because remember, the German officers married Jeannot and Leon. That I thought was pretty unusual. So people were starting to disappear or be assassinated, and that's why also too Mandel was holding up the statue of Clemenceau, another political figure. And it's not because, as he said, as he was leaving, not because I thought Clemenceau was going to protect us, it's to give us courage to continue. So I think having the radio there and the newspapers was kind of a way of just kind of tightening up and making it shorter and quicker to say, okay, they're starting to be aware of what's happening and they know that the war is ending.
Right. Just try to get all the shift together as close as they can. Right.
Right.
And that makes sense. I'm sure, they spent a couple of years there trying to get all of that.
Right. And as I said, they may very well have had the radio, and they may very well have had newspaper access. That I don't know. Mm-hmm. But I also think it's interesting that Joachim was a Jehovah's Witness that was there to take care of them. So they kind of throw that in there as well. So, it's like, how could they not know what was happening in the camp when Joachim was in the striped uniform, the black and white striped uniform, and had the purple triangle?
Well, and they mentioned specifically Joachim had come from the camp.
Right.
So it's not like they just brought him in. And for those not completely familiar with the camp systems, the purple triangle that you saw in Joachim's uniform was very commonly used to denote conscientious objectors. There we go. I have Eileen here speaking 4 languages. I'm struggling with the first. And largely Jehovah's Witnesses within the camp systems. Different triangles would denote different inmate types: black for criminals, red for prisoners of war, onward and forward. But unless there's any other questions, I do just want to take a moment to thank everyone that's come tonight, to thank Katie and Sarah from the JCC for having us. And Lindsay does have one last question, so I will hold on to my thanks again. I love it. She says, last question: how is Leon Blum viewed by the French today? I seem to remember seeing streets named after him.
Mm-hmm. He's highly respected. Remember, even though France in many ways was highly, highly anti-Semitic during the war, especially since the Dreyfus affair moving forward to the present day, where anti-Semitism is on the rise in France, he is widely respected, and he is honored. And once again, I can't say it enough, he made the 40-hour work week, and he made paid vacations.
And something that actually, Eileen, I believe you were the one who really keyed me in on this, is in France, their identities is they were French first. You are a French Jew, you are a French Catholic, you are a French, but always French first. And even thinking of how Blum is viewed today, there's a kibbutz in Israel named after him, from survivors, named the Kfar Blum after him in Israel. There's a memorial to him there. he definitely, I believe, got his due after the war, and he only lived 5 years after. But yeah, I mean, I think he is luckily not one of the unsung heroes, perhaps not as known as he should be, given how key he was to rebuilding France. But yeah, absolutely.
He was de Gaulle's silent partner.
Yeah, he was the power behind the throne. I will use it there. Uh, he was that unifying voice that France needed. Um, okay, I will give just 10, 15 seconds, see if any other questions pop up. But Eileen, I do want to thank you so much. I always enjoy doing these with you.
And I love working with you, Marcus. This is we covered a lot of territory tonight. So thank you.
Yes, say 1940 to 1945 France gets very busy, folks. I highly recommend keeping an eye out. Coming back next year to do this. These film festivals are a fantastic place to really get to learn really important and often overlooked parts of our history. So thank you again, Katie, Sarah, the JCC in Buffalo, for having us tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Marcus, and thank you, Dr. Angelini. It's always a pleasure to work with you, Eileen. And Marcus, it was great to have you join us tonight. I know you're joking, but yeah, in my head, I'm already thinking French film for next year, so I can re-invite you guys back because you did a fabulous job. It was fascinating to find out some more of that historical content that made some of the parts of the film just that much more relevant. So I appreciate you guys taking the time tonight. And as I mentioned, this is our final talk back of our festival. So I just wanted to quickly say a couple more thank yous again to our sponsor for this film and tonight's talk back, Hadassah, as well as the rest of our film festival sponsors. I also just want to thank our volunteer committee that helps to screen all the films. We had a wonderful selection this year, showing 13 films virtually. So I hope that many of you got to watch them and enjoy. And please continue to check the JCC website. We might try to do some individual films and other film programming throughout the year. And then, of course, we'll have our annual festival again. Hopefully we'll have some in-person events more so than this year. So I'm looking forward to it. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening and stay well.
Thank you so much.
Merci.